all, and thank you so much for joining us today for this Ringle Live session. Yes, my name is Maria. I'm an academic and corporate editor. I also work as a brand consultant. And outside of all of those kind of professional things that I'm doing, I also work as a professional actor and comedian. So I've got a fun sort of two halves to my career. I studied English at the University of Cambridge, and a lot of those techniques and strategies for analysing texts will be coming in useful during today's session. So let's take a look at what we'll be looking at today. To start off with, we're going to be thinking about the book and the author. So we're looking at Holes by Louis Sachar. We'll then take a look at the plot and explore some of the primary themes that this book is grappling with. And then in the final 15 minutes, we'll take a sneak peek at a passage from the book, and I'll offer you some questions that will allow you to guide your reading through the first section of this book. We'll start off by thinking about some key facts around the book. So this book was published just at the turn of the century, back in 1998 in the US, by an author called Louis Sachar. Now, the sort of genres that this book is encompassing are young adult. So that's things like the Hunger Games, even the Harry Potter books, I guess you could call young adult books as well, but also dystopian fairy tales. And I'll explain a little bit more about what I mean by that in a second. And we've got these major themes being introduced here of fate, punishment, morality. This is very much a book about what it means to be good and what it means to be bad, and who gets to define which people are good and which people are bad. Now, we've got this phrase dystopian fairy tale here, and this might be a kind of unfamiliar phrase to some of you. First of all, we have that word dystopian. Now, dystopian fiction is a genre of fiction that focuses on societies that don't work or are in some way fundamentally broken. Often it uses those broken societies to comment on our own society in the present moment. So things like The Hunger Games, for example, comments on social inequality. The Handmaid's Tale comments on the role of women and the rights of women within modern society. Both of these are dystopian bits of fiction that use that dystopian landscape to comment on our own current societies. But this is a book marketed towards younger people. And so Sachar combines this quite dark genre with the magic and the playfulness of a fairy tale. And I believe that he does this to make his narrative more accessible to a broader range of readers. There are lots of aspects of this that feel like something that you would read about in a fairy tale that you would read to very young children. The way in which morals are introduced and are realized in the course of this narrative feels very much like a fairy tale to me. So we've got this dystopian fiction. We've also got it combined with the playfulness of the fairy tale. And especially because we just saw that lizard on the cover, I also want to introduce this famous quote from the book. And there's a quote that we'll be returning to because it really does sum up some of the core themes at play in this book. So the narrator says, "A lot of people don't believe in curses. A lot of people don't believe in yellow-spotted lizards either. But if one bites you, it doesn't make a difference whether you believe in it or not." And this is really interesting. This idea that belief is less important than the actual events that happen to you over the course of your life, the things that happen in your life. And this is an idea that we'll be introducing. And like I said, we'll be thinking more about those yellow-spotted lizards, that lizard that we see on the front cover as well, as we move through the sessions over the next few weeks, because certainly these yellow-spotted lizards have a really kind of heavy symbolic weight in this book. Let's then think about Louis Sachar as an author. And what's interesting here is that nothing that is on this page is especially remarkable. He went to UC Berkeley, which is an Ivy League college, and he did economics. So actually, that doesn't have much to do with writing books. He worked in a sweater factory, so making jumpers after university. And then he went to law school. So he went to USC, he went to the University of California, where he studied law. And he then was a practicing lawyer. So over the next sort of 10 years or so, he was just practicing as a lawyer while also writing his books. He finally made that transition to becoming a full-time writer in 1989. But Holes is one of the later books that he published. He published it in 1998. And in 2003, he adapted that book into a movie by Disney. So he has a fairly kind of conventional average career. Maybe it's a career similar to some of your careers as well. He did economics, he went to law school, he became a lawyer, but he also managed to balance that with this wonderful creative career. That is why we have this great book that we're looking at today. Now, Sachar himself acknowledges that he didn't have a particularly exciting life. In fact, he's quite proud of how his life is quite mundane. In an interview, he said, "My personal experiences are kind of boring. I have to make up what I put in my books." And I love this because often, especially if we're involved in the creative arts, we're told, oh, well, you need to draw from your personal experiences. You need to have an interesting life if you want to make interesting books or interesting fiction. And he said, I don't think that's true. I had a very normal life, but I'm still able to make really interesting books because I use my imagination. I make things up. And I love that. I think that's a really wonderful approach to have. Now, outside of thinking about the book and the author, let's also think a little bit about the narrative before we get into the nitty-gritty of it all. So Holes is told primarily from the perspective of Stanley Yelnats. And yes, Yelnats is Stanley spelt backwards. It's told in the third person as well, and we'll think a little bit more about what that means in the next couple of slides. But I want to introduce some language to you here because we'll be using this language throughout the next few weeks. First of all, we've got that word protagonist. Now, the protagonist is the central character of the book. This is the person that you are rooting for when you are reading the book. But the opposite of that is an antagonist. And the antagonist is the bad guy, basically. So your protagonist is your good guy and your antagonist is your bad guy. This is the central villain of the book, the person that we want to see brought to justice, the person that is trying to disrupt whatever the protagonist is trying to do. And then, like I said, this book uses the third person, which means rather than using the first pronoun I did this, I went to this, I explored this, it uses the pronouns he, she, and they. So Stanley did this, he did this, Catherine Barlow did this, she did this. And I want to talk a little bit about the difference between third person narratives and first person narratives. So third person and first person narratives feel very different when we are reading them. When we read in the third person, we are an onlooker. We're almost imagining that it's almost like watching a movie. When you watch a movie, you're not seeing something through the eyes of a character most of the time. You are seeing from a more distanced perspective what that character is doing and how that character is interacting with their surroundings. Now, this means that we as readers often get to see things with more perspective than the individual characters. We often know things that the characters don't know. And that means that third-person narratives tend to be more objective. They tend to more completely represent the actual facts of a situation. And that's important because this book involves multiple different narratives, which we'll think about in a second. But often we know facts through those narratives that individual characters don't know. So it's useful for us to have that perspective. And it means that we can then encourage our protagonists to do things that maybe they don't even know they're meant to be doing at a particular point in time. Now, third-person narratives tend to be used when we are exploring more than just one character's viewpoint, or when they want to examine kind of broader contexts, broader settings. This book is about a community, this Camp Green Lake. And by focusing on the third person, Sachar, as an author, allows us to get more of an insight into every person within that community, rather than just seeing it through the limited perspective of Stanley. On the opposite side of the spectrum, we have first-person narratives, and this is where we, as a reader, are reading through the first person. I do this, I do that, and that means that we kind of take on the role of the character themselves when we are reading. Now, this means that we only see what they see. We only know what they know, or believe what they believe. And this means that often these sorts of books tend to be more subjective. We see what people think is happening rather than what is actually happening a lot of the time. Now, first-person narratives then are used when we want to give the reader an insight into someone's mind. How does someone's brain work? How do their thoughts work? How do they come to certain conclusions or form certain opinions? But we also use first-person narratives when we want to explore how unreliable any individual person's understanding of a certain scenario can be. To give a very brief example of this, there's a book by Henry James called What Maisie Knew. And What Maisie Knew is about the divorce of two people, but it is told entirely through the perspective of their 7-year-old daughter. So, what does a 7-year-old know about divorce? What does she think is happening with her parents? We don't learn the facts of the divorce. We don't learn exactly what each of her parents did or why that marriage went wrong. We only know what she knows. And therefore, it's very unreliable, but it's also a very interesting insight into one person's mind. So two very different ways of telling stories. And we're thinking about third-person narratives today. So in Holes, this third-person narrative is used to give us perspective. Like I said, there are multiple different narratives here. Yes, we have Stanley, but we also have Elya, who exists in historical Latvia. We have Catherine Barlow, who exists in the 19th century. And as we move between each of these settings, we get to know those protagonists because this author is using the third person. Sachar also uses this to give us more information than the characters know, so that we can build this nuanced understanding, this very complex understanding, very sophisticated understanding of how individual characters are connected, how settings and timelines and these threads of fate that we'll be talking about as we go throughout today's session are all related to each other, more than any individual character within that could possibly know. So there's a lot of interesting stuff going on here through Sachar's use of the third person. Let's think in a little bit more detail about the plot and the themes of this book, because there's a lot going on here in terms of this book's plot, and a lot going on in terms of the themes that it is playing with. So first of all, we have 3 separate plot lines in this book. We have Stanley's plot line. So he's the protagonist, and he's at Camp Green Lake. We also have Elya's plot line. Elya is Stanley's great-great-grandfather, and he's in historical Latvia. And then we also have Catherine Barlow, and she is in the town of Green Lake, roughly 100 years before the events of Stanley's part of the novel. All of these narratives kind of are introduced separately, but impact each other and affect each other as the novel progresses. So let's start with Stanley, and we'll think a little bit about Stanley as a character as well. So Stanley believes he is cursed with bad luck, and we'll be thinking about curses in more detail as we go through this session, because curses and fate and destiny are all big themes in this book. He's sent to a juvenile detention center for a crime that he didn't commit. He was accused of stealing some sneakers that he didn't actually steal. And while he is at this juvenile detention center, he is forced to dig holes in the desert with his fellow campmates. And there's no real explanation for why these campmates have to dig these holes, especially initially. They're just told that they have to dig them. And this is being kind of led by the warden. So the warden is arguably the central antagonist of the book. The warden is the central bad guy, or bad woman in this case, because she's a lady. And all we know, especially in the early stages of the book, is that she is searching for some mysterious lost treasure, but we don't know much more than that. So there's a lot of uncertainty in Stanley's narrative. We're then introduced in chapter 7 to the character of Elia. Now, Elia lives in historical Latvia. He is Stanley's great-great-grandfather. And before we even meet Elia as a character, Stanley tells us very early on in the book that he believes that his bad luck is because of what Elia did. So Stanley's great-great-grandfather, Elia, goes to an Egyptian fortune teller, Madame Zeroni, and he asks her for advice on how to win the heart of the woman he loves. But, crucially, he forgets to pay the fortune teller back. The fortune teller asks him to carry her up a mountain so that she can drink from the stream at the top of the mountain, and he forgets to do this. And that is supposedly where this curse comes from. So we're introduced to Elia in chapter 7. And then much later in the book, about halfway through, I think in maybe chapter 22, we are introduced to Catherine Barlow. Now, Catherine Barlow is a school teacher. She seems like a very lovely, very wholesome, very gentle woman. And she happens to fall in love with a black man, which was illegal at the time. And we'll talk a little bit more about that a little later. Now, when the richest man in town, this town of Green Lake, before it became the Green Lake that we know from Stanley's part of the novel, the richest man in town decides to raise a mob to kill her lover because she she fell in love with this black man, Sam, rather than falling in love with him, even though he was very wealthy. Now, this prompts this big kind of chain of cause and effect. And this ends up with her killing the sheriff and fleeing the town after these townsfolk murder Sam, her lover. And she then goes on to become Kissing Kate Barlow, one of the most infamous outlaws in the West. So we're introduced to this character via the name Kissing Kate Barlow before we are ever introduced to Catherine Barlow as a character. And then we finally hear her story about halfway through the book. So these are our three narratives: Stanley's narrative, Elia's narrative, and Catherine's narrative. And as each of these narratives unfold, we begin as readers to understand the relationships between each of the characters in each of these settings. How does what Elia does impact Stanley? How does what Catherine does impact Stanley? And this allows us to trace the impact that our ancestors can have on our present day reality, how the events of the past can impact the present and the future. That's all quite a lot to handle, though. There's a lot of different plots introduced here and a lot of different things introduced. So let's also look at all of this from the perspective of themes, so we can work out why all of these plots are introduced and what they are working to do in this particular narrative. So there are 4 themes that I would like us to consider as we read through this book together. The first theme is fate, and specifically the kind of bad side of fate, which is this idea of a curse. The second is the impact that history has on us through immigration, ethnicity, events of the past impacting the present. The third is this idea that if you are cruel to someone, you can make them violent, even if they weren't violent to start off with. And that's a very interesting theme that's introduced a couple of times in this book that I'd like to cover. And then finally, and we won't talk as much about this theme because I don't want to spoil the ending for people who haven't read it. But finally, we have this idea that the thing that can cure curses and the negative effects of history and cruelty and violence is friendship. And that's kind of what we come to realize towards the end of the novel. Let's start off with that first theme, fate and curses. So very early on in chapter 3, we are told that Stanley's family is cursed by his no good, dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-great-grandfather, who is, of course, Elya Yelnats. And lots of bad things have happened to Stanley, have happened to Stanley's dad, Stanley's granddad, and he believes that all of these things that have happened are the product of this particular curse. So we've got this great quote here, and Stanley says very early on, when the shoes first fell from the sky, he remembered thinking that destiny had struck him. Now he thought so again. It was more than coincidence. It had to be destiny. Now this ties to the crime that Stanley is accused of committing. Stanley is accused of stealing a pair of shoes, but actually those shoes literally just seemed to fall from the sky into his hands, and then he was caught holding them by the police, and he didn't even realize that those shoes had been stolen. So this is a bad instance of destiny. These shoes fall into his hands, and then they mean that he ends up at this particular camp having to dig holes. And there's just one example of how Stanley feels that he's cursed. These very random, bad things keep happening to him. We've got this idea that they are more than coincidence. They have to be destiny. I can see a couple of questions in the chat, and I will definitely come to them towards the end of this session. So keep popping those questions in there, and I'll address them towards the end of this session. So when you are reading through this book, and specifically these early chapters that you'll be reading in the next week or so before our next webinar together, I would love you to think about which actions are the product of characters' decisions and which actions happen to them by fate or by chance. How much of this book is people deciding to do things, and how much of this book is things happening to people by coincidence or by destiny, as Stanley believes? And I'd also like you to ask yourself, do you think that Stanley is really cursed? Especially when you're reading these early chapters. So I think chapter 1 to 18, which is what you'll be reading over the next week or so. When you're reading these early chapters, do you think that Stanley is really cursed? Or do you think that this is just a coincidence? These bad things are just happening by accident. So 2 things to think about with regards to fate and curses, and we will touch back in with these questions in our next webinar as well, so I can hear what you guys think, but also so that we can talk a little bit more about how this theme progresses over the course of the first third of this book. We're also introduced to this idea that history can impact us. Elya's curse, for example, is supposedly impacting Stanley, but also in more literal ways, who we are is informed by our ancestors, our parents and their parents. So we can look at this from 2 very different perspectives. First of all, immigration. You know, if our parents choose to move to a different country, that means that we are born in that country, we grow up in that country, and that has a very big impact on who we become. But also race. You know, the race of people, especially in the past, had a big impact on how they were treated. But equally, there are other ways in which someone's race and someone's ethnicity can have an impact on who they are as a person. So let's start by thinking about immigration. And in chapter 7, when we are first introduced to the character of Elya, Madame Zeroni tells him that he should go to America. Like my son, that's where your future lies, not with Myra Menka, who is this girl that he's in love with. So here we have this fortune teller telling this young boy, I think he's only 15 at this point, that his future lies not in Latvia, but in America. And we see that that's true because we see that Stanley, his great-great-grandson, is in America. So we've got this idea that very literally, sometimes we are destined to, move to a different country and have that impact our children and their children. So again, I want to throw some questions at you. And these are questions that we will return to and consider over the course of the next few sessions together. So when you're reading, I would like you to ask yourself, what does it mean for someone's future to lie in a different country? What does that phrase mean to you? And on a personal level, how do you think that you would respond if someone told you that? If someone told you, hey, your future lies in a different country? And equally, I'd like you to also think about how Stanley's life was impacted by his great-great-grandfather's decision to immigrate. How is Stanley's life different because he's living in America? How would his life have been if his great-great-grandfather had stayed in Latvia? What would have changed? What would have stayed the same? There are other characters introduced in this book who are also immigrants or the children of immigrants, and we'll talk more about them as we come to them. But this is a book that very much explores this idea of what does it mean to be living in America, even if your ancestors weren't born there? How does that change your relationship with that particular country? We also have this second impact of history. And this is the fact that really not that long ago, people of different races and ethnicities were treated very, very differently, especially in the US. And this is spelled out for us very, very explicitly in the book. So in chapter 26, the sheriff of Green Lake tells Catherine it's against the law for a Negro, a black man or a black person, to kiss a white woman. It ain't against the law for you to kiss him, just for him to kiss you. And that's really interesting. The fact that she, as a white person, has power and authority that this black person doesn't have, just because of the color of his skin. Now, this particular part of the story takes place just 8 years after slavery was abolished in the US. Slavery was abolished in 1870. But even in this period of time, racism was still very widespread and very, very explicit. So even though slavery was technically illegal, it was entirely legal for white people to discriminate against black people due to a series of laws that were called Jim Crow laws. And this is something that you'll hear used a lot if you're looking at American history. You'll hear about these Jim Crow laws and the effect that they've had on American society. Jim Crow laws prevented black people from voting, from seeking an education, which is something that we see in this book. Sam, this black character, isn't allowed to go to school, the school that Catherine teaches at. And they are also prevented from being in relationships with white people. So the end of slavery didn't mean the end of racism in the US. And I think that's very important. And we still see that playing out in other ways as well within modern day and within Stanley's narrative, where we see some of these immigrant children who are at this camp also experiencing instances of racism. Now, this narrative goes into quite a dark place when it is exploring Sam's character. So Sam is lynched by the town for kissing Catherine. And after this event, the narrator tells us, since then, not one drop of rain has fallen on Green Lake. You make the decision. Whom did God punish? Now, this word lynch is a very ugly word, especially in the history of the US. The town's decision to form a mob that then goes and kills Sam without any sort of legal process or trial is what's known as a lynching. So this idea of just a community randomly deciding that they are going to kill someone because they don't like what that person is doing. That's the definition of lynching. And it's estimated, according to PBS, that 2 to 3 Black people per week were lynched in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So this was a massive part of American history. So when you're reading this, the kind of first question that I would like you to ask is, why do you think that Sachar chooses to introduce this very dark narrative and this very dark part of America's history in a children's novel? Why do you think it's there? And I'd also like you to examine, and this isn't something that you'll be doing next week, but it is something that you'll be doing for our third webinar together, because this part happens in the third webinar. When Sam as a character is first introduced, what do you notice about how he is described? Specifically the color of his skin, his race, his ethnicity. What do you notice about when we learn that Sam is Black? And why do you think that Sachar chooses to delay sharing this information? Because it's very interesting when you actually read those sections. We aren't told that Sam is Black for quite a long time. And I'm interested in thinking about why. Why does Sachar withhold that? Why does he keep that information back? And what effect does that have on how we see Sam as a character? Then the third of these 4 themes is this idea that previously peaceful characters can be driven to violence because they have been treated with cruelty. This happens to Catherine, who then becomes Kissing Kate Barlow. It also happens to Zero. And we are told within this, 3 days after Sam's death, Miss Catherine shot the sheriff while he was sitting in his chair drinking a cup of coffee. Then she carefully applied a fresh coat of red lipstick and gave him the kiss he had asked for. For the next 20 years, Kissing Kate Barlow was one of the most feared outlaws in all the West. Now, again, this happens in the part of the book that we'll be covering in week 3 of this series of webinars, but there's some interesting things going on here. Firstly, the name changes. Miss Catherine, this peaceful school teacher, becomes Kissing Kate Barlow, this fearsome outlaw. And I want to ask you, why do you think that the narrator chooses to shift from Miss Catherine to Kissing Kate Barlow in this particular section over the course of these paragraphs? And what do you think that this shift in name and identity means for this particular character? Similarly, when you're reading through this book and you're thinking about the character of Zero, ask yourself, where does Zero's violence come from? He doesn't start out as a violent character, but as we move further through the book, he commits a very violent act. So again, where do you think that comes from? And then finally, and like I said, we're going to cover this in a little bit less detail because I don't want to spoil the ending, but this story has a very clear moral. And the moral of this story is this idea that friendship is the only thing that can break these cycles of cruelty and violence and curses. At the end of the book, without spoiling too much, it's an act of friendship that ultimately breaks this curse that may or may not be impacting Stanley and saves someone's life. So as we're reading through this book, right from the very early stages of it, I'd love for you to be thinking about what sort of power you think friendship has. Do you agree with Sachar that friendship has this power to resolve violence and save lives and heal trauma? And more broadly, why do you think that Sachar chooses to focus on this particular theme as the moral of his story? Why is this the note that he chooses to end on? Again, this is something that we'll explore more in our final session, because obviously all of this will become more relevant as we come towards the end of the book. But it's something I'd love for us to start thinking about even from the earliest sections. How is Sachar kind of hinting that friendship is a very powerful tool, even in these early chapters? So we've had a look at narrative. We've had a look at themes. Now let's take a little sneak peek at a passage within this book, and I'll also introduce some very specific guided reading questions for you to all look at as you are reading through the first 18 chapters of this book. So this sneak peek comes from chapter 2. It is actually the whole of chapter 2. Chapter 2 is very short. This is very early on in the book. It's the first time that we are introduced to Stanley. There's the first use of his name, and it comes just after chapter 1. And chapter 1 is entirely dedicated to describing Camp Green Lake. It's quite a brief description. The chapters in this book are very, very short. But the question that I want you to ask yourself as we read through this now together is, why do you think that Sachar chooses to introduce Stanley in this particular way? So let's read through this. And like I said, this is the whole of chapter 2. It's a short chapter. The reader is probably asking, why would anyone go to Camp Green Lake? Most campers weren't given a choice. Camp Green Lake is a camp for bad boys. If you take a bad boy and make him dig a hole every day in the hot sun, it will turn him into a good boy. That was what some people thought. Stanley Yelnats was given a choice. The judge said, you may go to jail, or you may go to Camp Green Lake. Stanley was from a poor family. He had never been to a camp before. And that's the end of the chapter. It's a very brief chapter, and it looks like there's not a lot going on here, but there's actually a lot to talk about here. I want to start off by thinking about this phrase at the beginning. If you had read the first chapter, if you had read this description of Camp Green Lake, were you thinking this when you then turned over to chapter 2? Were you thinking, hey, why would anyone go to this particular camp? And how do you feel when the narrator addresses you as the reader? How does that make you feel to think about yourself kind of in that relationship? It's quite unusual for the narrator to sort of step outside of their narrative role, to focus on the reader rather than focusing on the events of the narrative itself. So why do you think this is here? What's going on in this particular phrase? We also have this question. Why would anyone go to Camp Green Lake? And this is a rhetorical question. So this is a literary device. The narrator isn't literally kind of asking the reader to answer this question. The narrator isn't waiting to hear that answer, but instead the narrator is prompting them to consider it, making them think about it. I, for example, have asked a lot of rhetorical questions in this session already. I've asked a lot of questions that invite you to think about things, even though I'm not kind of expecting you to give me an answer right here and now. And like I said, there's a very common literary device that is used in novels. Now, this phrase literary device is something we'll be coming back to over the next few weeks, because I want to also introduce a few more literary devices to you. A literary device is any technique that is used by an author to help them achieve their purpose, to, get across a message or make someone feel a certain thing. So I see Sarah in the comments there has said that this is so sad. Literary devices are what are helping us to feel that sadness. Metaphors, similes, foreshadowing, all of these things are literary devices. And as we move through this book over the next few weeks, we'll be unpacking each of these and how they work one by one. Because equally, if you know how they work, you can also introduce them in your own writing and in your own speech. And they're very useful tools to use. Rhetorical devices are great to use in presentations, for example. Great to use to get people to consider questions that you want them to be considering in a business meeting. Now, this phrase, Camp Green Lake is a camp for bad boys. This is this kind of core moral question. This gets to the heart of what this whole book is about. What is a bad boy? And who gets to decide who is good and who is bad? Who decides the moral system that this book runs on? This very early passage, this page that is literally the third page of the book, is introducing this theme and is making the reader question this particular idea of what makes a bad boy very early on, because Sachar wants us to be thinking about this as early as possible so that that's in our minds as we read through the rest of this book. What you'll notice here is that a lot of this is very short sentences with very simple language. So here, most campers weren't given a choice. Camp Green Lake was a camp for bad boys. These are all single clause structures. They're very short and they're very simple. A clause, if you're unaware, is just a full grammatical structure. So that's normally noun, verb, noun. Mark ate the chocolate bar, for example. Noun, Mark ate, verb, the chocolate bar, noun. So anything that's a full grammatical structure that essentially could be its own sentence if it wanted to be. That's a clause, a full clause. And this particular chapter in general uses a lot of these very short single clause sentences because it wants to present the events of this chapter as absolute, unavoidable. There are no subclauses here. There are no ways in which the campers can avoid this fate. We're not told Stanley was from a poor family, but he had recently inherited some wealth. No, Stanley was from a poor family, full stop. That's the end. There's no way of him getting out of that particular situation. So the use of short single clauses is very striking here. And again, when you're reading through this book, I want you to consider what sort of sentences are being used, what sort of language is being used, and how is that shaping the way that you interpret the events that are being conveyed. Here then, for example, this is just an absolute truth. If you do this, it will do this. It's a first conditional clause. So this is a type of conditional clause that we use for just stating facts. And Sachar presents this as a fact. There's no sense of an opinion here. There's no sense of ambiguity. This is just an inevitable truth. But when we then look at the next line, Sachar undermines this by then saying, hey, well, that was what some people thought. Now, it's very useful or very striking here to see that this idea is divided over two lines and in two separate paragraphs, because what Sachar does is he kind of forces us to read that first line. If you take a bad boy and make him dig a hole every day in the hot sun, it will turn him into a good boy, and accept it as truth because it's being presented as truth. And then with the next paragraph, with the next line, he then introduces something that shifts that perspective, shifts that focus. So structurally here, he's breaking up ideas to control how we as readers interpret them. And the ways in which we begin to think about each of these particular ideas. Now, Stanley Yelnats was given a choice, parallels with this idea of most campers weren't given a choice. So we've got this parallel sentence structure, and we are invited to compare these two sentences, invited to compare how Stanley Yelnats is different from other campers because they're both at very visible positions. They're both right at the beginning of paragraphs. So it's very easy for us visually to see how similar these two structures are on the page. And then finally, we have this idea that Stanley was from a poor family, that he had never been to a camp before. And this introduces this theme of social class and how this factors into the decisions that we make when we grow up. Camps in the US, especially for children, are kind of luxury things. So over the summer months, when kids are out of school, they will go to these wonderful holiday camps where they will get to go canoeing and learn how to build fires and roast marshmallows. And Stanley just assumes that that's the sort of camp he's going to get sent to because he doesn't know enough about the justice system of the US. He doesn't know that he's being sent to a work camp. He assumes that he's being sent to a holiday camp. And of course, part of the reason that Stanley's family is so poor is because of the impact that history has had on him, because he's from this family of immigrants and because he is cursed by this bad luck. So again, this also ties into that theme of how history can impact us. This then also raises another quite interesting kind of moral question, which is, how do you think this situation could be avoided? When we're thinking about this more broadly, do you think that judges or kind of legal systems have the responsibility of explaining justice systems to criminals? If you were in this position, do you think that you might have been kind of tricked into making the same sort of decision because of a lack of knowledge or a lack of understanding? And again, this all ties into that core theme of justice and morality and what makes someone good versus bad. So it's a very short paragraph, but there is a lot of stuff going on here. And as you can see, I mean, we went through pretty much every single line in this particular chapter. Now, this style of reading, where we are interrogating how each individual phrase is working, the literary devices that are being introduced, the sorts of sentences that are being used, and the effect that all of that has on us, is called reading for meaning. And this is what I would encourage you all to do when you are reading through the first 18 chapters of this book over the next week. When you are reading, ask yourself, what does this make me feel? What opinions does this lead me to have about certain characters or themes or events? And most importantly, why? Why am I having these feelings or having these opinions? What bits of language or what literary devices, what sentence structures are being used by the book to achieve those effects? That's the big question that we'll be asking. This book seems fairly simple. The language in this book is fairly simple, but it's really not. There's a lot going on here, and it's very fun to pick through it and work out why certain bits of this book can have such dramatic impacts on us. So start this process by yourself over the next week or so. Ask yourself, what does this make me feel, and how? How is it making me feel those things? So, in terms then of your next steps for the next week, I will now be giving you a few guided reading questions. And your challenge now is to read the assigned portion of this book. So that's chapters 1 to chapter 18. Reflect on those guided questions that I'll be giving you, and share your answers with me on the band community. There's so much to talk about here, and specifically with regards to these 4 questions that I'll be introducing. But when you're reading, remember to read for meaning, especially when it comes to considering those questions, because reading for meaning will really help you to uncover the deeper layers of understanding behind these questions. So let's start out by looking at these first 2 questions. Stanley is initially very skeptical about the idea that he's cursed. He doesn't think that he is cursed. So what do you think? When you're reading the first 18 chapters of this book, do you think that Stanley's family is cursed? And most importantly, how does the text support your opinion? So reading for meaning, what's going on in this text to make you think that this curse is or is not real? The second question has to do with all of the many different campers that we are introduced to in these first few chapters, all of Stanley's fellow campmates. And they all have very interesting names like Zero and X-Ray. So why do you think that Sachar introduces all of these characters using nicknames rather than using their real names? And how do these nicknames, like Zero, like X-Ray, like Armpit, which is the name of one of the characters, how do these nicknames inform how we think of these particular characters? Again, ask yourself why certain bits of language are being used here, what effect that language might be having. And then the third question, we are introduced to Elia in these first 18 chapters, actually in chapter 7. And this narrative, Elia's narrative, is really mixed up with Stanley's. We have like one paragraph of Stanley's narrative and then one paragraph of Elia's, and then we go back to Stanley and then back to Elia, and we bounce between these two different narratives over the course of this chapter. So why do you think Sachar chooses to do this? Why do you think that he doesn't just separate out Elia into a different chapter and have these two narratives entirely separate? Why does he choose to mix them up as much as he does? And what effect do you think this has? So again, why is this book being written in this way? How is this shaping the way that we interpret it? And then the final question that I have, and I think this is a really interesting one to consider for the first 18 chapters, but it will continue being relevant as we go through the whole book, has to do with structure. A lot of the chapters in this book are very short. I'm sure when you saw that you were being expected to read 18 chapters, you might have thought, oh my gosh, that's so much text. It's really not. These chapters are so short. Chapter 2 is less than a page long. So why do you think that Sachar breaks up his story into such short chunks? And what effect do you think this has on the way that you read this book? How do these short chapters change the way that you think about the events of each chapter and the characters introduced in each chapter? So, 4 questions for you guys to consider there. Thank you all very much for joining me today. I cannot wait to continue this work with you over the next few weeks. Thank you all so much for joining me today.